So over the past 12 months or so, there's been an absolute truckload of discussion on YouTube relating to transgender people, transgender issues, and the whole business of transitioning, and then bringing in the idea of gender non-binarism and non-binary gender identities, even though most people, of course, who are transitioning still fit into that binary gender system there. But then also bringing in the idea of biological sex. Could there be more than two biological sexes? And then most recently, the other thing that seems to have got kind of convolved and tangled up in all of this is the business of intersex individuals. And recently, I suppose, what's kind of reignited all of this is a video by Michael Rowland a few weeks ago entitled "Gender and Sex is Binary!" What the fuck? And as a result of that, he had a hangout, I think, with Christy Winters, Tim Demotivator Opinion, and Kevin Logan. And then Tim had a hangout with Bearing where those issues were discussed. I know Bearing has made a number of videos on this. Quite a number of other people have made videos criticising Michael Rowlands in different ways. So I wanted to have my little input on this. So what I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about the business of biological sex with reference to what Michael Rowland says in his video, and then we'll talk about gender identities after that. So I think the first thing we should do is to play a clip of Michael Rowland's.
But then as soon as we talk about biological sex, nope, we got that perfectly right and there's only two. Well, I hate to break it to you, buddy, but you're wrong. First of all, you're ignoring intersex people. Intersex is a catch-all term for people who are born with a biological sex that does not align with the traditional sexual binary. And it's not one distinct category either. There are a variety of different biological sexes that can be classed under intersex. It's almost as if it was some sort of, spectrum or something.
Okay, so I think something that needs to be pointed out right from the outset, which hasn't kind of been picked up upon enough, I think, is that what Michael is talking about when he's talking about intersex people is he's talking about a medical diagnosis. And there is a difference between a medical diagnosis and a biological definition. And when it comes to the biological definition of the sexes, actually most people seem to be pretty much on the wrong tack with regard to this. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to play you another clip of Michael.
And did you know that there are more than two different karyotypes? A karyotype is a picture of a person's set of chromosomes, and I was always under the impression that these manifest in only two ways, XX and XY, male and female. Wrong. The six most common ways that these manifest are X, XX, XXY, XY, XYY, and XXXY. Man, who knew that human biology could be so complicated and not at all black and white?
So with respect to everybody that keeps on going on about XXXY in this context, this I think is where we're going wrong, because the whole business of sexual reproduction and therefore biological sexes and the way that we define biological sexes goes way beyond human beings. In fact, it goes way beyond mammals, and so that our definition has to take all of that into account. XXXY is the primary way the sexes are differentiated in the developmental processes of mammals, but it is not what defines male and female. In other words, in mammals, XXXY is nature's way to create the defining factors, but it isn't the defining factors. What is the defining factor between male and females is gamete size. Males produce the smaller gametes, sperm. Females produce the larger gametes, eggs, and that extends across all the sexual reproducing species in the animal kingdom. So to be frank, this is not just something that we can casually meddle with, right? We can create lists of all these different gender identities that some people have just plucked out of their arse, quite frankly, and it doesn't really matter to quite the same extent because, yes, there might be some issues with that, and I'll talk about that later on in the video, but that only extends as far as human social systems extend and human social structures structures and our understanding of ourselves. Once you start talking about biological sex, anything you do to tinker with that definition has ramifications that at least affect the whole of the animal kingdom, and perhaps goes beyond that to things like the plant kingdom as well, depending upon what exactly it is that you do. And that brings me back to Michael Rowland and his insistence that intersex people demonstrate the third biological sex. And again, I have to make the point that intersex is a medical diagnosis. It isn't a biological definition of a new sex. Let me show you something, and this is from the Intersex Society of North America. Right, so these are people that know what they're talking about with regard to intersex conditions. And they posted a list of disorders on their website. Notice they call them disorders. Okay, and that's for the benefit of Tim Blake. I know he gets a bit antsy about words like abnormality and disorder. He wants us to call them variations because he sees these other things as negative words. This is the Intersex Society of North America calling them disorders. The important point is if you look at some of those, let's look at micropenis, which sounds like the kind of penis that would be really useful in the modern internet generation, but it isn't, right? It is somebody, as you can see from this definition, it is a male. It is somebody that has undergone normal male development and would be more than capable of producing sperm, but just has a penis below a certain length. That is why they are medically diagnosed as intersex. And then there's clitoromegaly, which is the opposite. That's women with a really big sort of bullet clit. So they've got a clit that's about the size of a micro penis, and a micro penis is a penis that's about the size of an extra large clitoris. Okay, so that's why they've got that. But somebody who suffers from micropenis is still biologically defined as male because they produce sperm. Somebody who has clitoromegaly is still biologically defined as female because they produce eggs. So can you see, Michael, if you start incorporating these people into this new biological sex, you've really fucked things up, because now you've got egg creators that don't class as female, and you've got sperm creators that don't class as male. And to give you an example to highlight the difference between Michael's frankly quite worryingly carefree approach to biological sex and how a scientist would view it, let me read you from an article from the publication Trends in Ecology and Evolution, February 2004, if you want to look it up. A piece entitled "A Major Evolutionary Transition to More Than Two Sexes?" ? Now, I haven't followed this up, right? So I don't know whether this has been validated or falsified. And the reason I haven't done so is that doesn't really matter for the basis of what I want to say. Okay, so let me just read you out part of the abstract, and then I'll tell you what I want us to take from this. Okay, 2 recently discovered cases of genetic caste determination in social insects might provide the first example of a major evolutionary transition from 2 to more than 2 sexes. I argue here that the system can be interpreted as comprising primarily individuals requiring gametes from 3 parental types and having 4 sexes from the perspective of demographic extinction. Michael, can you see what a very, very high bar has been set here? This guy hasn't come along and said, oh, look, I've just found a random ant with a wonky cock. Look, there's an example of a third biological sex. Look at the bar that he set, mate. Primarily, you've got to take part of the business of sexual reproduction to class as a biological sex. And his primary argument, is that he's suggesting that 3 parental types may be required just to have the process of sexual reproduction. He then makes a more tentative argument and says, well, maybe you could class something else as a 4th sex if we view it from this perspective of demographic extinction, if that 4th category was not there. Okay, look how different that is to what you are claiming for intersex people, when in actual fact intersex people actually are males in a biological sense, or females in that they are producing eggs or producing sperm, or they don't produce either of them and so aren't playing any part in the business of sexual reproduction whatsoever. And look, part of the reason that we have some of these discussions about intersex people and how we need to be a little bit careful about how we talk about these things is that traditionally intersex people have got a very, very raw deal. notwithstanding the fact that generally people have tried to act in what they regard as their best interests. That's what the medical community has generally done. The consensus view has been that to fit in society, people need to fit into these traditional sort of gender roles as we see them, so that when you have these people with these intersex conditions, it is in the best interest of the individual to make sure that they are physically shoehorned into one of these categories. And tragically, that has not always been in the best interests of those individuals. Sometimes with terrible consequences, sometimes with suicidal consequences. Now, I'm empathetic to that and I'm aware of that. But Michael, I don't think the answer to that is to insist that we need to create a third biological sex. How about I propose to you instead? The answer is simply just not to try and shoehorn people into a system that effectively is not applicable to them. It's just like if you was to ask me, Michael, what part of Africa I'm from. The answer to that conundrum is no more to create a new part of Africa that's going to account for me than it is to insist that somehow I'm shoehorned into either being North African or Sub-Saharan African. Neither of them really do what we want them to do. Much better to just accept that the idea of being African isn't something that's really applicable to me. But look, as interesting as all of this discussion of intersex people is, right, it's kind of a little bit of a red herring in terms of the discussions that we were having, which were about transgendered people, and whether people believing themselves to have a different gender identity and transitioning in terms of their perceived gender identity so it matches their inherent gender identity in some way changes them from male to female. My answer is that it doesn't, Michael, and that's not based on narrow-mindedness, it's based on the things that I've suggested. And I don't really see how intersex and the discussion of intersex people is aiding your cause, because let's get rid of the intersex people that are male, that do produce sperm and do produce eggs. Even if I was to accept those other intersex people as forming a third biological sex, which I don't, but if I was, I still don't see how that is doing the work that you need it to do. It's very much like me saying to you, I desperately want to transition from a human to a gorilla, and you saying, but no, that isn't possible, right? These are different types of ape. And then I say to you, but it's not a binary, Michael, because there are chimps as well. Right? I mean, it's a total non sequitur, isn't it? Just showing that there's a third biological sex in no way would do the work that you need to do in suggesting that transgender people can not just transition in terms of gender identity, but are transitioning in terms of biological sex when they have gender reassignment surgery. And so to sum this part of the video up, I suppose contrary to the kind of impression that Michael gives, it's not due to narrow-mindedness or prejudice that I'm not prepared to accept a third biological sex in human beings. It's because I don't think Michael has gone anywhere near close enough. You know, a very high bar is set for this because it's a biological definition, and he's limboing under that bar with feet of clearance to spare. That is the problem that I have with regard to this. I don't think he's making a very solid claim, and in any event, I don't see the relevance to it. I don't see the relevance in terms of definitionally. You know, humans are bipedal apes, and the fact that Michael's best mate only has one leg in no way falsifies that in terms of our understanding, but also in terms of the whole business of transgender people and the business of transitioning. How does this even relate, this business of a third biological sex, to the idea that people can transition not just in terms of gender identity, but in terms of biological sex? Which brings us neatly, does it not, to this whole business of gender identity. And I view gender identity in a very, very different way than I view biological sex. I've already given you an inkling in one term, which is that what we talk about in terms of gender identity applies to humans and not necessarily follows in terms of other species in the same way that biological sex does. So we don't have to be quite so concerned. But nevertheless, I don't want us to make shit up just for the sake of it. Okay, but what seems quite clear to me, because I'm not somebody who believes in the blank slate, right? I believe that we come out with predispositions, and I believe that some of those predispositions are of a gendered nature, that generally men and women perceive things in slightly different ways. I can't tell you exactly what those things are, although when we look at the development of children, it gives us some idea of what those things are. And we have some understanding where people have been brought up in one gender identity. It's been forced upon them. And if you believed in the blank slate, then that should just apply to them. If you bring somebody up as a boy, if you bring somebody up who turns out they're actually a girl as a boy, then they would just accept it. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and often it leads to tremendous depression, sometimes suicidal tendencies, right, if people are brought up in a gender identity which is not the gender identity that they identify with. So I can accept that. I can accept that people's brains, if you like, the sex of their brain is different to the biological sex that they have. I accept that. Okay, so I accept that you can have that kind of dysphoria, but I also accept that gender identity can exist on a spectrum in the way that biological sex can't. Why? Because you can only produce sperm and eggs. You can't produce spegs, right? There is no middle point there. Unless you can show me a middle point, nobody else has discovered such a thing. Whereas gender identity can be a little bit different. Why? Because men's and women's brains are a little bit different. They don't function in that same polarized way. You have sperm, you have eggs. Do you have men's brains and women's brains? No, you don't. And it's been shown that you don't. But what you do have in terms of brains that men have and brains that women have are statistical differences. In the same way as you have statistical differences in the heights. Men tend to be taller than women, but there are no men's heights and women's heights. There are these statistical differences, and it is the same thing with brains. There's no discrete men's brains and women's brains, but there are these statistical differences between them. So that's a very, very different system, because it means that men's brains and women's brains exist upon a spectrum. And if they exist along that particular spectrum, then why can't their gender identities exist along a spectrum? So I have no problem with that. But keeping all of that in mind, I want to play you a clip now of Michael talking about gender identities and gender pronouns.
Secondly, it confuses me as a lover of language. Constant objections I often hear are things like, these people are just making up a bunch of words. They're using words how they're not supposed to be used. 64 pronouns, that's too many! It all smacks to me of people complaining about something that has absolutely no effect on them. Different people who are different from you, who want to do life differently from you, and that offends some people for some reason. Why does it matter to you so much if a person doesn't conform to the rigid gender identifiers that are ingrained to us from birth by a culture that is obsessed with cramming people into tiny little boxes of conformity? Why does it matter to you if someone wants to be addressed as she, or ni, or vi, or spivik?
Okay, so that's Michael's perspective, and I know that his position is that he tends to see other perspectives as narrow-minded and dismissive of these different gender identities in some kind of way. I've got to tell you, Michael, that I personally couldn't give a crap if there's two gender identities, 33 or 333. There isn't some magical number beyond which I'm going to blow a fuse, right? But I do want to see some kind of, the very kind of thing that you poo-poo at the end there is just the kind of thing that I want to see, because I put it to you. Right, and I don't care if you dismiss everything else that I say. I kind of expect it because it's me saying it, right? But if there's one bit I'd like you to take seriously here, is that actually when we start putting things into boxes, that isn't when we're dismissing things. That is what we do when we take things seriously. And I am sure, right, I am sure from all the things that you've said that you are trying to take these issues seriously. But honestly, mate, when I hear you talk about it in this way, it actually sounds like you're the one that's trivializing these things. It's as if, well, all these things is so trivial. What does it matter to you? You know, almost like, what does it matter what shit these people come up with about their gender identity? It's not important. Well, the fact is, it is important. People's gender identity is very, very important to them. And so if we're going to take that on board on society, then we need to get a bit more serious about how we're going to describe these things. And if you look at things that we are serious about, such as, let me show you from the census, let me show you on the census, that the categories that we use in the United Kingdom for religion and lack of religion, or what about for race? They put it down as ethnicity. They have a bit of one of these issues with, I don't think that's the best term. The best term to use here is race rather than ethnicity, but they call the question ethnicity. But look at the thought that's gone in that and the structure. They're looking at what they expect to be the breakdown of the United Kingdom, and they've applied some kind of taxonomic methodology, right, to the categories that are going to be involved in there. They've not just spewed out random terms or allowed people to define their race however they want. And why have they done that? Because that is something that we take seriously. So this is why I said in a previous video that I believe that what is needed is some kind of taxonomic pruning. We need to get rid of two things. We need to start spotting duplicates that exist, where two terms just mean the same thing, right? To sort of see really what are the different gender identities, the essentially different identities. And we also need to start putting some actual definitions on these things, because if you can't tell me what the difference is between, look, this is the list that the New York City came out with: bigendered, crossdresser, drag king, drag queen, femme queen, female to male, FTM, gender bender, gender queer, male to female, MTF, non-op, hijra, pangender, transsexual, trans person, woman, man, butch, two-spirit, trans, agender, third sex, gender fluid, non-binary, transgender, androgyne, gender gifted, gender blender, femme, person of transgender experience, androgynous, right? Can you even put a definition on gender blender that's actually going to stand up to any scrutiny, that's going to actually have any traction? And what is the difference between female to male and FTM? Isn't there just some redundancy there? The very fact that we're allowing these things to stand, to me, shows that we're not taking them seriously. I mean, imagine if I gave you a similar list here with regard to race. So here's my list with regard to race, Michael. Biracial, cross-racial, racially fluid, tonal trender, Hispanificacious, accidental, occidental, chinker tinker, A-black, mega race wangler, Pacific panchromal warrior, multi-race mixmaster, super hue blender, black and tan, super honky honkmeister, honkmeister supreme, wide gamut gambler, person of mixed race experience, and my personal favourite, blacker and cracker. Now, when I give you that list, does that smack to you of me taking the business of people's racial identity seriously? No, I suggest that it doesn't. What would give you an idea that I was taking it seriously is showing you a list like featured on that census data there. And if we don't undergo that kind of process, then how do we go about the business of gathering data in the kinds of ways we need to if we're going to deal with issues of equality and discrimination? How would it even work? Okay, so it's Mr. Kevin Plum. Okay, thank you, Kevin. So before I can give you the advice, I mean, you'll have done all this lot before. You know the score. I've got to take down a few details, for statistical purposes. So I can just ask you a few questions. That would be brilliant. Okay, first question then. How would you describe your ethnicity? Would you describe yourself as white British? Yeah, I'm a super honky honkmeister. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. A super honky honkmeister. Okay, I see. Let's have a little look here. Super honky. Okay, here's the thing. I haven't actually got that category on my form. Would you object if I just took you down as white British? No, that's not okay. Okay, look, can I just ask you a question? I hope you don't think I'm being intrusive here, but your parents, what was the ethnicity of your parents? Your mother? White British. Okay, and your father? Yeah, again, white British. Okay, so maybe we could just put you down as white British then. No, that's not okay, shitlord. I'm sat here in front of you and you're acting as if I don't even exist. I'm so sorry, Mr. Plum. Listen, insulting you was the last thing that I wanted to do. I tell you what we'll do. Let's take that question. We'll just put that one to one side for now, and we can come back to that one later. Let me ask you. Yeah, this is a nice, straightforward one. How old are you, please? 44. 44? Yeah, 44. Okay, 44. There we go. That one wasn't so difficult. 44 years old. No, not 44 years, you chronophobe. 44 Gallifreyan Uber seconds. Jesus Christ. It never used to be like this. You know, it was about the time the government employed that fucking Michael Rowlands as their chief scientific advisor that this shit started happening. Okay, so that's a little bit of fun, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I hope the point is well made, Michael. It is not as you assert it is in part of your video, where you say that people just can't stand new words. I can stand new words, but it has to do what it says on the tin, Michael. It has to do what you claim it is doing, which is defining something new. If that is the case, then that is absolutely fine. My concern is that most of the time it isn't. It's just extra verbal diarrhea that's adding to the miasma and making things cloudy and making things less clear. It's not helping anything that New York City come out with this list of 32 gender identities, that Facebook has a list of 70 odd gender identities. Asking for a bit of structure, asking for a bit of pruning and a bit of thought, right, is not trivializing things. It's not waving things away. That is the very business of taking these things seriously. And that's what I think that we need to do. Okay, that's the end of the video. That's pretty much all that I needed to say. If you like this kind of crap, A, see a doctor, and B, if you're not subscribed, subscribe to the video. Also feel free to give me your patronage and your support, and also feel free to sacrifice your firstborn in my name if you so wish. Thank you for watching this video. Bye for now. Jesus Christ, you never Jesus Christ, you never you know, Jesus. Jesus Christ, you never, you know. I'm just a super honky honk my star.